The loom stood silent for 3 years, gathering dust in a workshop that smelled of absence and old wool. And when I finally returned to it, my hands had forgotten how to weave. I stood in the doorway on a cold morning in February 2024, looking at the space that had once been the center of my life, the wooden floor scattered with fiber scraps, the shelves lined with cones of yarn in every color, the warping board on the wall, still holding the ghost of a project I abandoned when the world shut down. The loom itself, a 8-harness floor loom my grandmother had given me 20 years ago, sat in the corner like a judgment, its heddles hanging limp, its beater tilted at an angle that suggested defeat. I had been a weaver once. I had made cloth with my hands, had understood the logic of warp and weft, had created patterns that people wore and used and treasured. And then a virus had arrived, and everything had stopped. And when the world finally started moving again, I discovered I no longer knew who I was or what I was supposed to be doing with the thread that remained of my life. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day. And if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. My name is Elena Vasquez, and before the pandemic, I ran a small textile studio in Portland, Oregon. I wove scarves and shawls and table runners, taught weaving classes twice a week, sold my work at craft fairs, and through a few boutiques that specialized in handmade goods. It wasn't lucrative hand weaving, never is, but it was sustainable. In that precarious way that creative work can be when you're willing to live simply and work constantly. I had a rhythm, a routine, a sense of purpose that came from making beautiful things with my hands and sharing that craft with others. March 2020 shattered all of that. The craft fairs were canceled. The boutiques closed. My classes moved online for a few weeks and then just stopped because teaching weaving through a computer screen is like teaching someone to swim. Through a telephone, theoretically possible, but practically absurd. The students needed to feel the yarn, to understand tension by touch, to make mistakes with their hands, and learn from the physical feedback of the loom. A video call couldn't replicate that. I tried to adapt. I posted videos on social media, showing my process, hoping to build an audience that might buy online. I offered virtual consultations for people setting up their own looms. I even started a Patreon where subscribers could watch me weave and ask questions. But my heart wasn't in it, and more importantly, my income had evaporated. By June, I'd blown through my savings. By August, I'd taken a job doing data entry for an insurance company, work I could do from home, work that paid the bills but felt like dying slowly. 8 hours at a time. The loom sat unused. At first, I told myself I'd get back to it on weekends, but weekends came and went, and I couldn't bring myself to thread the heddles or wind a warp. The creative part of me had shut down, gone dormant like a plant conserving energy through winter. Except winter kept lasting, month after month, and I began to wonder if spring would ever come. I wasn't alone in this. Everyone I knew was struggling in their own way. My friend Marcus, who ran a pottery studio, had pivoted to making hand sanitizer dispensers, ceramic vessels, for a substance that symbolized our collective terror. My sister, a professional violinist, was doing virtual performances to empty living rooms, trying to maintain technique while waiting for concert halls to reopen. We were all in suspended animation, maintaining the forms of our lives while the substance drained away. The isolation was the worst part. I lived alone in a 1-bedroom apartment, and suddenly alone meant truly alone. No classes to teach, no markets to attend, no casual interactions at the grocery store beyond frightened nods from behind masks. I video called my parents in New Mexico every Sunday, watched my mother's face on a screen, and felt the inadequacy of the connection. Screens were everywhere, mediating every interaction, flattening every relationship into pixels and compression artifacts. By 2021, I'd stopped calling myself a weaver. I was just someone who used to weave past tense, a former practitioner of a craft that no longer seemed relevant in a world where people were dying by the thousands, and the economy was collapsing, and political chaos was accelerating. Who needed hand-woven scarves when the air itself might kill you? Who cared about craft when civilization felt like it was fraying at the seams? I got vaccinated in March 2021, and then again, and then boosted. And slowly the world began to open up again, tentatively, inconsistently. Restaurants reopened with outdoor seating. Stores removed their capacity limits. Masks became optional, then recommended, then political statements rather than public health measures. Life was supposed to return to normal, except normal had been gone so long that no one could quite remember what it looked like. I kept the data entry job. It was stable, predictable, required nothing of me emotionally. I showed up virtually at 9, logged my hours, logged off at 5, and spent my evenings watching television or scrolling through social media, consuming content the way you consume empty calories, filling time without nourishing anything. The loom sat in the corner of my apartment, a monument to a person I used to be. By late 2023, something was shifting in me. I can't point to a specific moment or catalyst, but I became aware of a restlessness, a dissatisfaction that went beyond the general malaise of post-pandemic existence. I was surviving, but not living. I was maintaining, but not growing. The data entry job, which had seemed like a lifeline in 2020, now felt like a cage I'd built for myself, comfortable and suffocating. I started having dreams about weaving. Not symbolic dreams, literal ones, where I was at the loom, throwing the shuttle, watching patterns emerge from chaos. I'd wake up with my hands moving, phantom motions of a craft my body remembered even if my conscious mind had tried to forget. These dreams were unsettling, insistent, like something deep in my psyche was trying to tell me that I'd left part of myself behind and needed to go back for it. In January 2024, my company announced layoffs. My department was being restructured, automated, outsourced, the usual euphemisms for "we don't need you anymore." I had 60 days. The news should have terrified me, but instead, I felt something unexpected. Relief. The decision was being made for me. The cage door was opening, which brings me back to that February morning, standing in the doorway of the workshop I'd been renting, but not using for 3 years, paying the monthly fee out of inertia and an inability to fully let go. The space was exactly as I'd left it, frozen in March 2020, like Miss Havisham's wedding feast, but with yarn instead of cake. Dust covered everything. Spiderwebs connected the loom to the wall. A coffee cup sat on the workbench, its contents long since evaporated into a brown ring. I walked to the loom slowly, like approaching a wild animal that might bolt. When I touched the wood, it was cold, inert, just a piece of furniture rather than the living instrument it had once seemed. I sat on the bench, positioned my feet on the treadles, and tried to remember. My body knew the posture, the alignment, but the sequence of movements, which treadles to press, when to throw the shuttle, how to maintain even tension, all of that had become foggy, uncertain. I had been a weaver. Could I become one again? Or had too much time passed, too much changed, too much been lost? The question hung in the dusty air as I sat at the silent loom, and I realized that answering it would require more than just relearning technique. It would require understanding what had broken in me during those years of isolation, what needed to be repaired, and whether the threads of my former life could be woven into something new, or if I needed to start with completely different materials. I stood up and began cleaning. It was the only place to start. Remove the dust, clear the cobwebs, make the space usable again. As I worked, I found artifacts of my former life, notes from students, sketches of pattern ideas, receipts from yarn purchases made in what now seemed like ancient history. Each item was a small reminder of who I'd been, breadcrumbs leading back to a version of myself I'd lost track of. By afternoon, the workshop was clean enough to see clearly. The loom stood ready, waiting for me to dress it, to give it purpose again. But I wasn't ready yet. I locked the door and went home, exhausted in a way that felt good, physical, rather than the soul weariness I'd been carrying for years. That night, I pulled out my old notebooks, the ones where I'd kept weaving records, project notes, yarn calculations, pattern graphs. I flipped through pages filled with my own handwriting, technical notes interspersed with observations and ideas. There was a project I'd been planning when everything shut down, a series of shawls using natural dyes and hand-spun yarn. I'd bought the fleece, had it processed into roving, had even started spinning some of it. Where was that fleece now? I found it the next day, stored in plastic bins in my closet, miraculously not moth-eaten or ruined. The wool was still good, still full of potential. I pulled out a handful of roving merino, undyed, soft and crimped, and sat down with my spinning wheel for the first time in years. Spinning came back faster than I expected. My hands remembered the motion, the gentle pulling and twisting that transformed cloud-like fiber into strong thread. The wheel hummed, the spindle turned, and yarn appeared as if by magic, though I knew it was just physics and practice, and the muscle memory that doesn't entirely fade even after years of disuse. I spun for hours that evening, creating a small skein of singles, yarn that would need to be plied before it was strong enough for weaving. The act was meditative, soothing in a way I'd forgotten was possible. There was something profound about starting with raw fiber and creating something useful through nothing but my own hands and a simple tool. No electricity required, no internet connection, no screens, just wool and wood and human skill. Over the following weeks, I established a new routine. I still had my data entry job for a few more weeks, but every evening and all weekend, I was at the workshop or spinning at home. I started simple, weaving plain cotton dish towels to relearn the basics. Threading the heddles was frustrating. My fingers felt thick and clumsy, and I made mistakes that my younger self would have caught immediately. But I persisted, and slowly the knowledge returned. There's a particular state of mind that weaving induces, something between meditation and mathematics. You have to pay attention to the pattern, counting threads and treadles, but once the rhythm is established, your conscious mind can wander while your hands continue working. It's in that state that I did my best thinking, where problems solved themselves and ideas emerged fully formed. I'd lost access to that state during the pandemic years, and finding it again felt like returning home after a long exile. As I worked, I started thinking about what the pandemic had done to craft, to making things by hand, to the whole economy of handmade goods that had been thriving if precariously. Before 2020, so many artisans I knew had given up entirely, unable to survive the long months without income, unable to adapt their practices to online sales and virtual interactions. The craft fair circuit, which had been the economic backbone for many makers, had collapsed and not fully recovered. Some fairs came back, but attendance was down and buyers seemed more cautious, more inclined to save money and spend it on handmade luxuries. But there were countercurrents too. During lockdown, many people had taken up crafts knitting, sewing, bread making, all the domestic arts that had seemed quaint or unnecessary in the busy before times suddenly became ways to occupy anxious hands and minds. Yarn shops, those that survived, reported unprecedented sales. Online craft communities exploded. People were making things again, perhaps recognizing that consumer goods could unfill the particular need that comes from creating with your own hands. I wondered if there might be a market for what I wanted to make, not the trendy, Instagram-ready crafts, but the slow, traditional, labor-intensive work of hand weaving. It seemed possible that the pandemic had shifted something in the collective consciousness, made people more aware of of where things came from, more appreciative of objects made with care and attention rather than mass-produced in factories overseas. My last day at the insurance company was in March 2024, 4 years almost to the day after the pandemic had started. They gave me a severance package that would cover my expenses for about 4 months if I was careful. 4 months to figure out if I could make weaving work again, or if I'd need to find another soul-crushing but stable job. I decided to treat those 4 months as an experiment. I would weave seriously, professionally, as if this were already my viable career. I would create a new body of work, document it properly, reach out to galleries and boutiques, and see if there was still a market for what I made. If it failed, at least I would know I'd tried. If it succeeded, I'd have my life back. The first challenge was deciding what to make. My previous work had been beautiful, but safe scarves in classic patterns, table linens in traditional designs. Nothing wrong with that, but also nothing that would make someone stop and reconsider what hand weaving could be. I wanted to make something that reflected what I'd been through, what we'd all been through, something that spoke to rupture and repair, isolation and connection, the way we'd all been broken and were trying to piece ourselves back together. I started experimenting with intentional flaws, with disrupted patterns, with threads that didn't quite match, with sections where the weaving became loose or irregular before tightening up again. In traditional weaving, these would be mistakes, signs of poor craftsmanship. But I was trying to make them meaningful, to create beauty from imperfection, to show that brokenness didn't preclude wholeness, just a different kind of wholeness than we'd started with. The first piece in this series was a shawl woven in gradations of gray, from nearly white to charcoal, with sections where the pattern broke down entirely, threads crossing chaotically before resolving back into structure. I called it March 2020, and when I finished it, I sat looking at it for a long time, unsure if I'd created something profound or just made an expensive mess. I posted a photo on Instagram, my first craft-related post in years. The response was immediate and surprising. Comments poured in from other makers, from people who'd also lost their practices during the pandemic, who recognized in my disrupted weaving a metaphor for their own disrupted lives. Someone offered to buy the shawl before I'd even decided whether to sell it. Others asked if I taught classes, if I did commissions, if I had more work available. The attention was gratifying, but also overwhelming. I'd forgotten what it was like to have people interested in my work, to feel the pressure of expectations. During my data entry years, no one expected anything of me beyond accurate spreadsheets. Now suddenly people were asking when my next piece would be ready, whether I'd be at this fair or that market. Could I create something custom for a specific occasion? I had to be careful not to let external pressure drive the work. The point of returning to weaving wasn't to become commercially successful, or not primarily. It was to reclaim a part of myself, to engage in work that felt meaningful, to create beauty in a world that had seemed too dark for beauty to matter. If commercial success came as a byproduct, wonderful, but it couldn't be the goal, or I'd end up right back where I started, doing work I didn't care about just to pay bills. I created more pieces in the After Contagion series. That's what I'd started calling it, the body of work exploring pandemic rupture and recovery. Each piece dealt with different aspects of the experience. One shawl used only black and white stark and uncompromising, with sharp transitions between sections representing the binary thinking that had taken over so much of public discourse. You were careful or reckless pro-mask, or anti-mask rational or hysterical with no room for nuance. Another used brilliant colors, but with threads that didn't quite align. Beautiful but discordant, like trying to return to joy after trauma and finding that joy doesn't quite fit the same way anymore. The physical act of weaving these pieces was therapeutic in ways I hadn't anticipated. Each throw of the shuttle, each depression of the treadles, was a small act of putting things in order, of creating structure from chaos. The repetitive motion was calming, grounding a counterpoint to the anxiety that still lurked at the edges of my consciousness ready to surge whenever I thought too much about money or the future or the fact that I was betting everything on a craft that most people considered obsolete. In April, I was invited to show my work at a small gallery in Portland that specialized in fiber arts. The owner, a woman named Sarah, who'd been running the gallery for 20 years, had seen my Instagram and wanted to feature the After Contagion series. We met at the gallery on a rainy afternoon, and I brought 4 pieces to show her. Sarah examined each one carefully, running her hands over the fabric, holding pieces up to the light, checking the selvages and the way the patterns transitioned. She was silent for a long time, and I felt my stomach tightening, waiting for judgment. "These are remarkable," she finally said. "They're technically excellent, which I expected from seeing your older work online. But more than that, they're honest. They're about something real. So much craft work is just pretty, and there's nothing wrong with pretty. But these pieces have weight. They carry meaning. Will they sell?" I asked, because I had to know, because pretty sentiments wouldn't pay my rent. Sarah smiled. "I think they will, but probably not quickly, and probably not for what they're worth in terms of labor hours. Hand weaving is a hard sell. People don't understand why a scarf costs $200 when they can buy one at Target for $15. They don't see the hours of work, the skill involved, the fact that you not just buying fabric, but a piece of someone else's life and attention. So why do it?" I asked, "Why run a gallery for fiber arts if it's such a hard sell?" "Because it matters," she said simply. "Because in a world of mass production and algorithmic design and items engineered to be replaced, handmade things are acts of resistance. They insist that time and skill and human attention have value. They connect us to a tradition of making that goes back thousands of years. And honestly, because sometimes people do understand. And when they do, when someone buys a hand-woven piece and really sees it, really appreciates what went into it, those moments make everything else worthwhile." We agreed to show 6 pieces with an opening reception in June. Sarah would take a 40% commission on anything that sold, which was standard for galleries. I'd priced the pieces to cover my materials and some portion of my labor, knowing I couldn't charge anything close to minimum wage for my time if I actually wanted them to sell. As I left the gallery, walking through the rain back to my car, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: excitement about the future. Not certainty. I was still terrified about money, still unsure if this was sustainable, but at least excitement. A sense that I was moving towards something, rather than just surviving another day. Over the next 2 months, I worked intensely, creating new pieces for the show. I expanded beyond scarves and shawls to include wall hangings, experimental pieces that were more art than functional textile. One piece incorporated broken threads left visible rather than woven in, allowing them to hang loose, representing all the connections that had been severed during lockdown. Another used layers of loose woven cloth over tighter structures, creating a gauzy, uncertain effect, like looking through fog at something that might or might not be there. I also started teaching again, offering in-person classes at my workshop for the first time since 2020. Was nervous about having people in the space, about being responsible for their learning, about whether I could still teach effectively. But I advertised a beginner weaving class for May, and it filled up within days. The students were a mixed Group 2 retirees, a college student, a woman my age who'd been wanting to learn weaving for years, and a man in his 30s who said he needed something to do with his hands that was untyping or scrolling. We met on Saturday mornings, and I taught them to warp a table loom, to throw a shuttle, to read a pattern draft, all the basics I'd learned decades ago and had been teaching before the pandemic interrupted everything. What surprised me was how much I needed this, not just financially, but emotionally. Teaching forced me to articulate what I knew, to break down processes I'd internalized into steps that beginners could follow. And watching my students learn, seeing their faces, when they completed their first few inches of weaving and realized they decreated cloth with their own hands. That was a gift, a reminder of why craft matters, why passing on these skills is important, even in a world that doesn't seem to need them. One of my students, the woman my age named Jennifer, stayed after class one morning to talk. She'd been a graphic designer. She told me had worked from home since the pandemic started and had realized she'd spent the last 4 years staring at screens, creating things that existed only as pixels, never as physical objects. She'd taken up weaving because she desperately needed to make something real, something she could touch. "I have hundreds of designs saved on my computer," she said. "Thousands of hours of work. And if my hard drive crashes, it's all gone." But this, she held up the sampler she'd been weaving. A simple pattern in blue and white. "This is real. I made it. It exists in the world. No one can delete it." I understood exactly what she meant. There was something almost radical about making physical objects in an increasingly digital world, about insisting that materiality mattered, that the tactile experience of cloth, its weight and drape and texture, couldn't be replicated on a screen. The gallery opening was scheduled for a Friday evening in mid-June. I was terrified. I'd done shows before the pandemic, but this felt different, more vulnerable. I was showing work that was explicitly about trauma and recovery. It revealed how broken I'd been, and maybe still was. What if people didn't get it? What if they thought I was being self-indulgent, turning personal pain into art in a way that felt manipulative or maudlin? Sarah helped me install the pieces on Wednesday, spacing them around the gallery's main room with care, creating sight lines and relationships between works. When we finished, she turned off the overhead lights and used spots to illuminate each piece individually. And suddenly, the gallery was transformed. The textiles glowed, their textures emphasized by the dramatic lighting, and the series read as a coherent statement, a visual essay about rupture and repair. "You should be proud," Sarah said. "This is strong work." The opening reception drew a larger crowd than I'd expected my students came, along with friends I hadn't seen in person since before the pandemic, other makers from Portland's craft community, and strangers who'd seen the announcement and were curious. People moved through the space, examining the pieces, reading the cards I'd written describing each one. Some visitors clearly didn't get it. I overheard one woman complaining that the prices were ridiculous for something full of mistakes, but others lingered, really looking, and several people asked me questions that showed they understood what I was trying to do. By the end of the evening, 2 pieces had sold, including March 2020, the first shawl I'd made in the series. A couple bought it, telling me they'd both gotten COVID early in the pandemic, had both nearly died, and had been trying to figure out how to mark that experience, how to acknowledge what they'd survived. They saw the shawl as a way to do that, a beautiful object that carried weight and meaning, that they could wrap around themselves and feel held by something that understood. I cried after they left, overwhelmed by the realization that my work had connected with them in such a profound way. That craft could do this, could carry meaning, could communicate experience that words struggled to express, could become a kind of shared language for processing collective trauma. The show ran for 6 weeks, and by the time it closed, I'd sold 4 of the 6 pieces and received 2 commissions for custom work. The money wasn't enough to live on long term, but it was something, proof that there might be a market for what I was making, that this wasn't just a foolish gamble, but a possibility. I started getting inquiries from other galleries, from magazines that covered fiber arts, from a podcast about craft in the 21st century that wanted to interview me. Suddenly, I had more attention than I knew what to do with, and I had to be intentional about not letting the attention become the point, not letting commercial pressure corrupt the work. Throughout all of this, I continued teaching, continued taking on students who wanted to learn not just weaving, but what weaving represented: patience, attention, the willingness to work slowly on something that might not succeed. The acceptance that mistakes are part of the process, and sometimes the most interesting parts. My workshop began to feel like a community again, a place where people gathered not just to learn technique, but to share the experience of making, to exist together in physical space, doing work that required presence and focus. By fall 2024, I was weaving full-time again, supporting myself through a combination of selling finished pieces, taking commissions, and teaching classes. It wasn't lucrative. I was making about what I'd made at the data entry job, maybe a bit less, but it was sustainable, and more importantly, it was meaningful. I woke up each morning knowing what I was working toward, excited about projects in progress, engaged with my work in a way I'd thought I'd lost forever. The pandemic had broken something in me, had severed my connection to my craft and my sense of identity. But the breaking I was discovering had also opened up possibilities. The work I was making now was deeper, more honest, more willing to show vulnerability than anything I'd made before 2020. I stopped trying to produce perfect things and started trying to make true things. And that shift had changed everything. One afternoon in October, I was working at the loom weaving a piece commissioned by a hospital that wanted something for their COVID memorial. A space they were creating to honor the staff and patients who died, to acknowledge the trauma the survivors carried. They'd asked for something that expressed both loss and hope, that didn't minimize the horror, but also didn't leave people mired in grief. I was using white and silver thread, creating a pattern that was mostly open and light, but with denser sections that caught the eye, drew you in, made you pause. As I worked, I thought about all the people who died, the million Americans and millions more worldwide, each one a universe of experience and relationship that had been extinguished. I thought about the healthcare workers who'd kept showing up day after day, watching people die, unable to save them, carrying that weight even now. I thought about everyone who'd lost someone, who'd had to grieve alone, who'd missed funerals, or had attended them through screens. And I thought about the fact that I was here, weaving, alive and mostly whole, able to do work I loved in a world that was still broken, but also still beautiful, still full of possibility. The loom clicked and clacked, the shuttle flew, and cloth appeared, thread by thread, a physical manifestation of time and attention, of the decision to make something rather than letting chaos win. When I finished the piece weeks later and delivered it to the hospital, they installed it in the memorial space, a quiet room with photographs and names, and this textile I'd made hanging where light could pass through its open sections, casting shadows and patterns on the wall. A nurse who'd worked COVID wards stood looking at it for a long time, not saying anything, just being present with it. And when she finally turned to me, her eyes were wet. "Thank you," she said simply, and I nodded because there was nothing to say that wouldn't diminish the moment. This is what cloth can do, what craft can do. It can hold space for experiences too large or too painful for words, can create objects that carry meaning without insisting on specific interpretation, can connect people across divides of experience by offering something tangible that says, "I see you. I acknowledge what you've been through. You're not alone." As 2024 moved toward 2025, I found myself thinking about the future differently than I had in years. During the pandemic, the future had seemed impossible to imagine, a void that I couldn't see past, couldn't plan for. In the years immediately after, the future had seemed like something to survive, to get through, a series of obstacles to navigate. But now, for the first time since 2020, I could imagine a future that wasn't just survival, but growth, possibility, continued development of my work and my craft. I started planning a new series, this one not about the pandemic itself, but about what comes after, about the slow work of rebuilding, about finding beauty in the repaired rather than the pristine. I was influenced by kintsugi, the Japanese art of repairing broken pottery with gold, making the breaks visible and beautiful rather than trying to hide them. I wanted to do something similar with weaving incorporating visibly mended sections, using different materials to mark repairs, creating pieces that celebrated the fact that they'd been broken and put back together. The technical challenges were significant. How do you break weaving intentionally in a way that looks deliberate rather than accidental? How do you repair cloth so the repair is obviously repair, but also beautiful, integrated into the piece rather than looking like a band-aid slapped over a wound? I experimented with different approaches, made a lot of pieces that didn't work, slowly figured out techniques that did what I wanted them to do. One breakthrough came when I started incorporating other materials: leather cord, metal wire, even plastic filament to do repairs, using materials that contrasted sharply with the woven cloth, but also brought their own beauty. A section of wool weaving repaired with copper wire created a striking visual effect, the metallic thread catching light differently than the matte wool, marking the repair while also making it a feature rather than a flaw. I showed some of these experimental pieces to my students, and one of them, a young man named Alex, who'd taken up weaving after dropping out of tech work, said something that stuck with me. It's like you re-arguing that being broken is part of being whole, that you can't really understand wholeness without brokenness. He was right, and I hadn't fully articulated it to myself until he said it. The pandemic had broken all of us in different ways, had shattered assumptions and relationships and routines we built our lives around. We couldn't go back to who we'd been before that innocence or naivete, or whatever you want to call it, was gone. But we could move forward as people who'd been broken and repaired, who carried visible scars, but also the knowledge that we'd survived, that we could be shattered and still become whole again, just in a different configuration. This understanding became the foundation of my work moving forward. I wasn't trying to recreate what I'd lost or return to some previous state. I was trying to build something new from what remained, incorporating the breaks and ruptures as part of the structure rather than flaws to be hidden or overcome. By early 2025, I had enough work for another show, this one focused entirely on the repair series. Sarah's gallery agreed to feature it, and we scheduled an opening for March 2025, 5 years exactly after the world had shut down. The symbolism wasn't lost on either of us half a decade after the break. Work about the repair. As I prepared for that show, I found myself reflecting on what weaving meant to me, why I'd been willing to risk financial security to return to it, what I was really doing when I sat at the loom. On the surface, I was making cloth scarves and shawls and wall hangings, functional objects and decorative ones. But below that surface, I was engaging in something older and deeper, something that connected me to thousands of years of human history, to every weaver who'd ever sat at a loom and created fabric from thread. Weaving is one of humanity's foundational technologies. Before we had writing, before we had cities, before we had agriculture in many cases, we had weaving. We've been creating textiles for at least 30,000 years, maybe longer. The technology has evolved from basic finger weaving to backstrap looms, to floor looms, to computerized, jacquard looms, but the fundamental principle remains the same: interlacing warp and weft to create a stable fabric. Every culture has developed its own weaving traditions, its own patterns and techniques and meanings associated with cloth. Textiles have marked status and occasion, have carried cultural knowledge and family histories, have been used as currency and art and everyday necessity. The cloth we wear, sleep under, sit on, used to mark occasions from birth to death. All of it comes from this ancient practice of interlacing threads. When I was weaving, I was participating in that tradition, adding my own small contribution to an art form that spans cultures and millennia. I was also doing something more personal. I was creating order from chaos, structure from potential, something whole from disparate parts. The process mirrored what I was trying to do with my life, and maybe what all of us were trying to do as we emerge from pandemic years into an uncertain present. The second show opened on March 15th, 2025. The gallery was packed. My student base had grown. Sarah had promoted extensively, and there was media coverage from local papers and craft magazines. People moved through the space examining pieces that showed visible repairs, that celebrated brokenness and wholeness existing together, that argued through fiber and form for a different way of thinking about damage and recovery. I gave a short talk at the opening, explaining the series, talking about my own journey from weaver to data entry worker, and back to weaver again, about what the pandemic had broken in me, and how craft had been part of putting myself back together. I was nervous about being so public with my story, but the response was overwhelming. Person after person came up to me afterward to say thank you, to share their own stories of pandemic rupture and attempted repair, to tell me that seeing their experience reflected in physical objects helped them process what they'd been through. 3 weeks into the show's run, I got an email that would change everything. It was from a curator at the Smithsonian's Renwick Gallery in Washington, D.C., which focuses on contemporary craft. They'd seen coverage of my work and wanted to know if I'd be interested in being part of a group exhibition they were planning about craft in the pandemic era, about how makers had responded to and processed collective trauma through their work. I had to read the email 3 times before I believed it was real. The Renwick Gallery, the Smithsonian. My work hung in a national museum, seen by people from around the world. It was beyond anything I'd imagined when I'd stood in my dusty workshop a year earlier, trying to remember how to thread a loom. I wrote back immediately, trying to sound professional rather than desperate or overexcited, saying yes, I was interested. When did they need to know? What pieces were they considering? The back and forth over the following weeks was surreal, discussing which pieces to include, arranging shipping and insurance, signing contracts that made me feel like an actual professional artist rather than someone who just made things in a workshop and hoped people might buy them. The exhibition was scheduled for fall 2025, and the curator asked if I could create a new piece specifically for it, something that would anchor the show, that would encapsulate what I was trying to say about cloth and contagion and recovery. I said yes before really thinking about what I was agreeing to, and then spent weeks terrified that I'd promised something I couldn't deliver. But I kept working, kept weaving, and slowly a concept emerged. I wanted to create something large, something that would fill space, that would be impossible to ignore or experience passively. I sketched out plans for a massive piece, almost architectural, that would hang from the ceiling and reach nearly to the floor, creating a space you could walk around or even partially into, that would surround viewers with cloth and pattern and the physical presence of handmade textile. The technical challenges were enormous. I'd never worked at this scale. My loom could only weave fabric about 40 inches wide, so I'd have to weave multiple pieces and seam them together, which meant planning carefully so patterns aligned, so seams became features rather than distractions. And I'd need to incorporate the repair aesthetic I'd been developing, showing breaks and mending at a scale that would be visible from a distance. I spent the spring and summer of 2025 working on this piece, which I called The Weaver's Return. It consumed me completely. I thought about it constantly, dreamed about it, worked on it every available hour. My teaching suffered a bit because I was so focused on this project, but my students understood, were excited for me, helped me problem solve when I got stuck. The weaving took months. Each section had to be planned meticulously, worked carefully, woven with attention to tension and selvages. I used natural dyes. I'd made myself indigo for blues, madder for reds, weld for yellows, creating a palette that felt organic, connected to earth and plant life rather than chemical processes. The patterns shifted across the sections, starting tight and controlled, becoming looser and more chaotic, then tightening up again, but differently with visible repairs, integrating copper wire and leather cord and raw silk thread that contrasted with the primary wool fabric. When I finally finished weaving all the sections, I laid them out in my workshop, and even unassembled, the piece was powerful. The shifts in pattern, the integrated repairs, the subtle color variations from hand dyeing, all of it came together to create something that told a story without words. That moved from order to chaos, to a different kind of order that showed breaking and mending and the beauty possible in both. Assembling the piece was another challenge. I had to figure out how to seam the sections so they'd hang properly, how to attach them to a support, structure that would be stable, but also allow the cloth to move slightly with air currents, creating a living quality. I worked with a friend who was a sculptor, who understood materials and engineering, and together we designed a frame using steel cable and wooden dowels that would support the textile while remaining mostly invisible. When we finally hung the completed piece in my workshop to test the assembly, I stood back and looked at it, and for the first time in the entire process, I let myself believe I'd actually done it. The piece was enormous, imposing, beautiful, in a way that felt earned rather than decorative. It filled space not just physically, but emotionally. You couldn't ignore it, couldn't experience it casually. It demanded attention, presence, a willingness to sit with what it was saying about damage and recovery, about the slow work of repair, about returning to work you thought you'd lost. I took photographs to send to the curator, trying to capture the piece from different angles, trying to show how it changed depending on where you stood, how light moved through its more open sections and was caught by its denser areas. She responded within hours. "This is extraordinary. Exactly what we need for the show. Can't wait to see it in person." The exhibition opened in October 2025, and I flew to DC for the opening reception. Walking into the Renwick Gallery, seeing my work hung in a museum alongside pieces by other makers whose work I'd admired for years was overwhelming. The weaver's return anchored the main gallery space, and it looked even better there than it had in my workshop. The high ceilings gave it room to breathe. The museum lighting emphasized its textures, and the context of the other pieces around it created a conversation about craft and trauma and creativity that was richer than anything I could have achieved alone. The exhibition drew significant attention, reviews in major publications, coverage on art websites, visitors from around the country. My work was discussed in terms I'd never imagined applying to what I made theoretical frameworks about materiality and memory comparisons to textile traditions. From other cultures' analysis of how craft can process collective trauma in ways that fine art sometimes struggles to do. But more meaningful than the critical attention were the conversations I had with visitors. People who'd lost loved ones to COVID, who'd been hospitalized themselves, who de-worked in healthcare or education or service industries through the pandemic. They told me that seeing these works helped them process what they'd been through, gave them language for experiences they'd struggled to articulate. The cloth carried their stories, held space for their grief and their resilience, insisted that what had happened mattered and couldn't be forgotten. One woman stood in front of the weaver's return for almost an hour, not moving, just looking. When she finally walked away, she came to find me and told me her husband had died of COVID in April 2020 alone, in a hospital, and she'd never gotten to say goodbye, never got to hold him as he died. She'd been living with that for 5 years, trying to find a way to mark his death, to honor what she'd lost. Seeing this piece, she said, gave her something, not closure, because that wasn't possible, but acknowledgement. Recognition that the world had broken, and we were all trying to put it back together with whatever tools we had. I didn't know what to say to her, so I just hugged her, and we stood there in the museum gallery, holding each other while other visitors moved around us. And it was one of the most profound moments of my life. This stranger trusting me with her grief because I'd made something that could hold it. The exhibition ran for 6 months, and during that time, I had to figure out what came next. I'd achieved something I'd never imagined possible: museum recognition, critical attention, financial stability from sales and commissions. But I couldn't let that become an endpoint. couldn't let the success become about maintaining status or repeating what had worked. I needed to keep growing, keep pushing my work into new territory. I started thinking about community, about how craft could bring people together rather than just existing as objects for individual appreciation. I developed an idea for a collaborative weaving project where multiple weavers would each create sections that would then be assembled into a larger piece, each person's work remaining distinct but contributing to a unified whole. The project would be about connection, about how we're all creating individual lives that interweave with others, about patterns that emerge from many people working in parallel. I reached out to weavers I knew, and to some I didn't, inviting them to participate. The response was enthusiastic people from around the country agreed to weave sections according to a loose set of guidelines I provided. Over the course of 2026, these sections started arriving at my workshop, each one unique, each one bearing the distinctive style and choices of its maker. Some were technically perfect, others showed the marks of less experienced weavers, but all of them were made with care and intention. Assembling them into a cohesive piece was challenging. I had to figure out how to honor each person as work while creating something that read as unified rather than fragmented. I worked with another sculptor friend to create a large frame, and we arranged the sections so they overlapped slightly, creating depth and shadow, allowing each piece to remain visible while contributing to a larger pattern. The finished collaborative piece, which I called Many Threads, was installed in a public space in Portland, hung in the lobby of a new community center. It became a gathering point, a topic of conversation, something that people from the neighborhood took ownership of because they could see their community. Reflected in it, the diversity, the individual distinctiveness, the way many separate efforts could create something larger than any single person could make alone. This project pointed the direction for my work moving forward. I'd started weaving again to reclaim something I'd lost, to repair what the pandemic had broken in me. But craft isn't just personal, it's inherently social, connecting makers across time and space, creating objects that move through the world, carrying meaning and beauty, and the evidence of human care and attention. As 2026 moved toward 2027, 7 years after the world shut down, I found myself thinking less about the pandemic and more about what I was building in its aftermath. The grief and trauma would always be there. You don't lose 3 years of your life and emerge unchanged. But that loss had also opened possibilities I wouldn't have discovered otherwise, had forced me to reconsider what mattered, what I wanted to do with the time I had, what kind of mark I wanted to leave. I was weaving not just cloth, but connection, not just patterns, but meaning, not just objects, but experiences. Every piece that left my workshop carried something of me into the world, my time, my attention, my care. My belief that beauty and meaning could exist even in the aftermath of catastrophe, that we could be broken and repaired and still whole, just in a different configuration than we'd been before. The loom that had stood silent for 3 years was now rarely still. Students came through my workshop learning the ancient craft, each one taking something from the experience, not just technique, but a different way of being present, of paying attention, of creating with their hands rather than just consuming with their eyes. The work was slow, demanding, sometimes frustrating, always rewarding in ways that had nothing to do with efficiency or productivity, or any of the metrics that dominate so much of modern life. This is what I'd returned to, what I'd rediscovered after years of feeling lost. The knowledge that making things matters, that craft is not a quaint hobby or a luxury for people with too much time, but a fundamental human need, a way of engaging with the world that connects us to our deepest history and our highest aspirations. The Weaver's Return was not just my personal journey back to my craft. It was a larger movement I was part of, a recognition that in a world of screens and algorithms in mass production, we needed handmade things more than ever, needed the evidence that human hands had touched something, that time and skill and attention had been invested in creating it, that not everything could be reduced to the most efficient or profitable option. When I sat at the loom now, throwing the shuttle and watching cloth emerge thread by thread, I wasn't just making fabric. I was participating in something larger, a tradition stretching back millennia, a practice that had survived wars and plagues and technological revolutions, that would outlast me and my work, that would continue as long as humans needed to create, to transform raw materials into beautiful and useful things, to make meaning through making. The pandemic had tried to take this from me, had nearly succeeded in making me believe that craft didn't matter, that making things by hand was pointless in a world facing existential threats. But I'd found my way back, had rediscovered that craft mattered precisely because the world was broken, that creating beauty and meaning was not a luxury but a necessity, not an escape from reality, but an engagement with the deepest reality, that we are makers, creators, weavers of meaning in a universe that gives us thread and asks us to create cloth. This is what I'd learned, what the loom had taught me, what those 3 years of silence had prepared me to understand. That returning is not about going back to what was, but about reclaiming what matters and carrying it forward into whatever comes next, thread by thread, one careful interlacement at a time, creating cloth that will warm and shelter and connect us, that will carry our stories and our dreams, that will outlast us and speak of who we were and what we made and why it mattered that we were here at all.